But this next topic is alternative access to medications that aren't PBS listed. So to speak about this topic, we've got Associate Professor Michael Dickinson, who is the lead of aggressive lymphoma on the CAR-T team at Peter MacCallum and Royal Melbourne Hospital. His main research interest is in developing new treatments for lymphoma through leadership in investigator-led and industry-led clinical trials, which have particularly focused on immunotherapies and epigenetic therapies for lymphoma. Michael has been intimately involved in the establishment of the CAR-T cell treatments in Australia. He also works at Cabrini Hospital in Melbourne. Michael is also a member of Lymphoma Australia's medical subcommittee. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks very much, Erica, and hello, everyone. It's great to have you online and participating in today's Zoom meeting. It's, really, I think it's a really special thing that Lymphoma Australia does. Hopefully this next session will be of interest to you. I enjoyed hearing that story in that video in particular, because it's actually becoming an increasingly typical story of patient experiences. And it just goes to show that the treatment of lymphoma is not usually a one-man show. It's not usually just your haematologist who's involved in your care. You have to excuse me, I'm recovering from something my children gave me, which is not COVID. So it's not usually a one-man show. It shouldn't be that your care is just from one haematologist. They should be connecting in with others. One of the important things about multidisciplinary team meetings is this question, access to medicines that we haven't thought of, or which are beyond the standard, or which aren't listed in the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. And I trust that you can see my slides. Just let me know, Erica, if you can't. So what are we trying to address today? Well, firstly, I thought it would be helpful to talk just very briefly about the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. Already I've seen in the comments a question about why the pharmaceutical benefits scheme doesn't fund drugs. And I think it's important to understand the bar that drugs have to get over to be funded by the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, and to think about drugs that are in that gap between knowing that they're effective for your lymphoma, but not yet available in routine care, and therefore potentially not known to your doctor as being available. I want to cover where the Therapeutics Goods Administration fits in, and then what it means to say that a drug is registered versus funded. And I want to highlight some of the special things about cancer drugs that you might not have known about, and which I, as a clinician, come up against all the time when I'm thinking about treatment options for my patients, particularly patients where standard options are becoming less and less applicable. I'll highlight about inpatient drugs versus outpatient drugs, public versus private, off-label use of drugs, and then, of course, compassionate access programs. And I thought I might just use the example of hydroxychloroquine and COVID-19 as an example to illustrate some points. So firstly, hydroxychloroquine is listed as a drug in Australia on the Registry of Therapeutic Goods. It's approved for rheumatologic diseases by the Therapeutics Goods Administration, and it's funded on the PBS for rheumatologic diseases. So you can buy it in Australia, you can buy it with a prescription, and the prescription says that the pharmaceutical benefits scheme can subsidise your prescription if it's used for rheumatologic indications. However, if your doctor prescribes it outside of its registered indication, then you shouldn't be funded by the PBS. You'd have to pay a full cost of that prescription, which sometimes, to be honest, is cheaper than the PBS anyway. And of course, there was this fad for using hydroxychloroquine in COVID-19 related disease. And so, by contrast, in Australia, of course, it's not funded for that example, but we saw a lot of prescriptions for hydroxychloroquine happening in Australia being used what we say off-label, meaning that the doctor can prescribe it, but it shouldn't be funded by the government. And the indication for COVID-19 is off-label, meaning not for the approved indication. So now I'm going to move to a second example and then try to bring this together to illustrate the point and where compassionate access programs fit in. So let's take the history of Pembrolizumab. Now, Pembrolizumab is also known as Keytruda. It's a checkpoint inhibitor. And checkpoint inhibitors are an example of a class of drugs that uses the immune system to control lymphoma, and which is active across a range of different cancers. In fact, it's approved for various solid tumor malignancies, and those approval in solid tumors came through first, but its mechanism of action is actually applicable to a number of different types of cancer. Now, it's not applicable to all types of lymphoma, and I want to emphasize that point, but it is applicable for some things. So it's approved for solid tumors. It's now approved for relapsed and refractory Hodgkin lymphoma in the third line. And it's approved for primary and mediastinal Bcell lymphoma in patients there's a type of there, also third line. So, the thing is that there are other uses. We know that there are some studies that suggest that pembrolizumab might be active in other settings for certain subtypes of lymphoma. But at the moment, we can only prescribe this high-cost drug. Its international price is in the order of $12,000 every 3 weeks. We can only prescribe this at a reasonable price in the pharmaceutical benefit scheme if we write the prescription for these specific indications. Now, I know that I might have a patient where I want to use pembrolizumab in the second line for Hodgkin lymphoma, and we know that there are trials using drugs like pembrolizumab and pembrolizumab frontline in Hodgkin lymphoma that suggest it might be active. But it's not funded for those indications, and therefore I'm not allowed to prescribe it under the current funding arrangements for those indications. But a patient may choose to buy it, if they're very, very wealthy and can afford the price. And so there are certainly circumstances, particularly when patients have exhausted standard treatment options, where I want to access a drug like Keytruda, and we have to start thinking outside of the box and looking to compassionate access programs or cost share programs to access the drug. And this is an example of a drug where the solid tumor approvals came through first. Everyone knew it was active in primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma for 18 months, 2 years before the approval got through. So what do we do for our patients with primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma where the data exists, but the funding hasn't quite caught up? So I'll leave those. I'm not going to answer that question. I'm just going to talk about the framing of the problem, where sometimes the evidence that a treatment works precedes its approval and funding. And there can be a gap where you know something works, but you can't access it affordably. And when we're thinking about self-funding drugs and compassionate access programs, there's a few important considerations, and the treatment setting is really important to understand. Outpatient versus inpatient, public versus private, cost share versus completely free, compassionate access, which is usually the completely free version, and some differences for people with private health insurance as well. And the first thing to say is that for patients who have public health care, and I work in a public organisation but also do private practice, the most state hospitals in most states, most of the time, 90% of the time, will not allow us to prescribe drugs that are not funded. The only circumstances is where an individual cancer department decides to fund it for a limited period of time. But if a patient comes in and says, listen, here's my $50,000, I just want you to give the drugs in your daycare centre, most of us are actually constrained from doing that. And the reason for that is largely around state government policies about how state governments are funded and how the funding is shared with the federal government. And it's also linked to issues around equity and the idea that the public health system should be equally available to everyone, whether they have money or not. That's a debate for another time, but that is a constraint that is placed on cancer doctors. The other thing to know is that it's easy for me to write a prescription for an outpatient tablet that may be active against your cancer. It's quite a different thing for me to write an intravenous drug. So if I'm working in a public clinic and I write a script and say, run down to the pharmacy and get this and use it, it might work in your cancer. That's kind of easy. It's a low bar to get over. But for me to get the hospital pharmacy to provide the intravenous drug means that I have to meet the rules for prescribing in the public system. In the private system, understandably, things are quite a bit looser. But there still is the issue that private insurance won't necessarily fund, in fact, typically do not fund drugs that are not funded by the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. But some private insurers do have compassionate access programs where a doctor can apply and say, listen, this is an example of a drug. And if we took the example of Pembrolizumab before it was approved in primary mediastinal B-cell lymphoma, we could say this is an example of a drug that's approved overseas. It works in this lymphoma. It just so happens the Australian government hasn't caught up, but this patient's been a patient of yours for, their entire life. Can you compassionately support the use of this drug? And some private insurance companies do come through, particularly where there's some evidence of an overall survival advantage. Now, if a drug is approved in Australia, that is, the Therapeutics Goods Administration says, yes, this drug works. Now, please apply to the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme to see whether it's cost effective for the government to pay for it. And there'll be some haggling over prices that goes on. If a drug is approved and it's in that gap between approval and funding, and there are some drugs that are approved but never get funded because the price never comes down to the threshold of cost effectiveness, then it may be possible to purchase the drug at your own cost. And there'll be a label price, which is typically the same price as the drug is sold anywhere else in the world. So the label price for Pembrolizumab is very high, and it's the price that they sell it for in the US, and there's a sort of global price. In Australia, it is possible the drug company does have a cost share program for individuals to apply for. There are some conditions for that, which offsets that total cost under certain circumstances. It's not my position to talk through that program today, except to say that it has existed for some patients and it substantially reduces the cost from the label price, but patients will typically be out of pocket, and that's called a cost share program. Now, different companies have different models for cost share programs. Some companies say, well, if the patient pays for the first dose and we're going to charge a very high price, then we'll give you the rest for free. So that the patient then takes on the risk of the drug not working for the first dose, but then the company supports the patient after that risk is taken and they're prepared to provide the drug for free. Other companies do a free cycle followed by a funded, the patient pays for one cycle, company pays for the next cycle, and you take turns as a way of mitigating the price. So there's a range of situations. And of course, the one that is the easiest to apply in many cases is a true compassionate access program where there is zero cost. And this typically applies for drugs where there isn't a label in Australia, and the company is therefore precluded from selling the drug. They're literally not allowed to sell it. They're not allowed to advertise it, but they are allowed to supply it under a compassionate access arrangement. And on a case-by-case basis, a doctor needs to inform the Therapeutic Goods Administration that this is potentially a life-saving drug. Now, in that situation, and there are some examples of compassionate access programs at the moment, you put in that notification to the TGA saying, I'm using a drug that's not listed in Australia, but it could save this patient's life. The TGA never gets in the way of that. That's a very simple process. The company must not charge money for that. I think it's against the law. It's certainly against regulations. And so they're the situations where free drug is often given away, and that's before a drug has got its label. Sometimes when there's a gap between a drug having a label and a drug being funded, the company will provide the drug for free as a way of supporting patients until it comes onto the PBS. But that's being done less and less often these days, and is sometimes frowned on by funders as being seen as a way of kind of marketing a drug. So different companies have different views about that. So how do you find these treatment options for drugs that are not standard? Where do you get this information? Will it be Twitter? Would it be Facebook? Do you have to read medical journals yourself? Do you have to be an expert, or should your doctor know all of this? Lymphoma Australia, of course, is a fantastic source. We know there are Facebook forums that patients participate in, which can sometimes be a source for information about potential drugs. And then, of course, just like the hydroxychloroquine thing, sometimes there's misinformation about how active a drug might be. And so it's very difficult for patients to filter this information. At the end of the day, it is your doctor's job to help you interpret the evidence and know whether the treatment might be active in you, and then to go and find out how best to access that treatment. So you have to think about this. So in doing that, we have to think about the status of a drug. And really, this is about what is the evidence that it works? Now, if a drug's approved for a particular indication, for example, the third line, Pembrolizumab for the third line treatment of Hodgkin lymphoma, that means a trial has been done and an authority somewhere has said, yes, this drug works for that indication. So the first question you could ask about a drug when you're trying to filter something you've seen on Twitter or heard on Facebook is that a drug that they can get in the United States or the United Kingdom or in Europe? Mantle cell lymphoma, for example, CAR T cells, they're approved in the United States for mantle cell lymphoma. So we know they can get them there. And the reason is the authority in the United States has said, yes, we've looked at the trial, the evidence is there, it's active. So that's the first thing. If the drug has approval somewhere for your particular indication, then that gives you some comfort that chasing down access for that drug is a reasonable thing to do. Approval is not the same as public funding. And of course, in the United States, the bar for approval is lower. So we see trials that really don't even meet my standards to show that this drug is going to be life-saving or particularly useful in a particular disease. But the United States says that it gets to the bar that says that it's okay. If it's approved in Australia, that is, a drug that you really want because that the Australian regulators have said it's active. They just haven't yet decided whether it's cost effective, which is where the PBS comes in. And so you have to ask your doctor and ask yourself, why is this drug approved but late to the party in Australia? Usually the answer is cost effectiveness. Sometimes you'll have drugs that are available in compassionate access programs before they're approved anywhere else in the world. And there are some examples in Australia at the moment in lymphoma. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how much data is there? And again, ask your doctor. This is about the idea that some drugs are approved on the basis of good randomized trials. Usually the time between a drug having a randomized trial and actually being approved for use is very short in major markets like the United States. But if it's just a phase 1 trial that shows that a drug is active, then it's quite preliminary data. And so you'd want to be more cautious about using that drug for a particular indication. And just because a drug is available in a compassionate access program doesn't always mean that it's the right fit for you. And the other thing, of course, is when you're reading this information to try to separate whether a drug shrinks your lymphoma versus whether it's likely to actually give you a benefit that you really care about. Why do companies give drugs away? Well, partly they give them away because they're not allowed to sell them. So if they're not actually approved, sometimes they give them away for strategy. So trying to get doctors to get used to prescribing them and understanding their side effects before they're allowed to market the drug. So for a company, sometimes there is actually a strategic reason that they do compassionate access programs. But I do believe that there is a genuine compassionate part for some companies as well. And for some companies, it's about picking up on signals about how a drug is going to be used outside of the context of a clinical trial. If a company's had a compassionate access program and then closes it, their reasons for closing the compassionate access program may be because they've now been approved for a particular indication. So for example, a drug that, I guess that they've been approved for a particular indication and funded, and so therefore they decide, well, the PBS can now pay for this drug. Or if the company's been working with government, cannot get it funded and says, actually, we can never realistically bring this drug to Australia. We can't give it away. And I can't think of really any examples of, for example, CAR T compassionate access programs, because some things are just ridiculously expensive. The examples of approval and fundings that overseas that are relevant for lymphoma, tafasitamab, polatuzumab vedotin, CAR T cell therapy for certain types of lymphoma where it's not available in Australia yet, but we know the data exists overseas. Examples there are follicular lymphoma and mantle cell lymphoma. A number of drugs for a number of oral medications for Bcell lymphomas. So venetoclax, we know you can get it in Australia for certain things. There are other lymphomas that it might be active in where it's not approved in Australia that it might be active. Selinexor is an example of a drug that is approved in the US for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, is now approved in Australia for diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, but unfunded. And of course, in T-cell lymphoma, it's a particularly vexed area where we struggle to get drugs. And romidepsin is a drug that we've had in Australia for a very long time that has never been funded in Australia for reasons that I can't comment on. So there are also examples of drugs that are active in lymphoma and are not approved anywhere. And they're the ones that you have to be particularly careful about as a patient. And they're the ones where, it really is hard to get access. And a good example that I've had recently is CAR T cells for central nervous system lymphoma. There are tiny studies showing that it might be active, but no regulatory body in the world has said, yes, it's reasonable to use CAR T cells routinely for brain lymphoma, for lymphoma that's primarily in the brain. And so it's going to be very hard in those circumstances to get access to that treatment. Bispecific antibody therapies are particularly close to my heart. This is a class of agents that is clearly active in lymphoma, but although there have been examples of compassionate access programs in these drugs, you have to be aware that they're not actually approved anywhere in the world. And so particularly where drugs are not approved anywhere in the world, there's likely to be very strict criteria about those compassionate access programs that patients have to fit before a doctor is given access to the drug for free from companies. How do you find out what's available? Well, the first thing, of course, is, does your doctor know? And the answer is companies are not allowed to market things that they're not allowed to market. And if they do market things that they're not allowed to market, they get in a lot of trouble. So companies are not allowed to proactively reach out to doctors and say, hey, did you know we have this compassionate access program in XYZ? They're actually not allowed to do that. The doctor has to approach the company and say, hey, I read that paper. Can I get that drug for this patient? And it's only when the doctor reaches out that companies are allowed to turn around and say, and this is why patients have this perspective of inequity, of access of knowledge. It makes me cranky that there isn't some kind of place you can go to find out about all compassionate access programs. But the apparent reason, and this is something Sharon and the team at Lymphoma Australia constantly work on, is the regulatory framework that companies have to work within. And they have to be very careful not to sell drugs that they're not allowed to sell. But that's how it could be that your doctor doesn't know. This is why your doctor participating in a multidisciplinary team meeting and being an expert in their field is so important, because, the knowledge that a compassionate access program is not available, is now available for a particular drug, is sometimes slow to get out there unless doctors are talking to each other, which of course we really must do as professionals. So in conclusion, there are quite a few drugs that are active in lymphoma that can be obtained. Access is not always easy. I didn't get to so access is not always easy, and it's not always possible for all drugs to be given in all treatment settings. So some hospitals are happy to give intravenous drugs as outpatients, but not on the ward, for example. I didn't touch on that, but there are some rules around that. Public hospitals in particular need to prioritise treatments that are available to everyone and not available to a selected subgroup of patients. So you'll find some public hospitals that are happy to do free drugs but not happy to do cost share drugs. And companies rarely give information directly to patients for regulatory reasons. And I'll finish up there and take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. I think that's probably raised quite a few questions as well too. So if you do have questions, everyone pop them down in the chat function here as well too. But at the moment, to facilitate the questions, I'd like to also welcome in Sharon, who is our CEO of Lymphoma Australia, and also Amy Lonergan as well too, who we all saw previously in the video. So Amy is one of our wonderful patients who is very savvy and has got compassionate access to medications. So I do have some group questions as well too, while everyone is coming through with their own questions. So for you, Michael, so I think something very topical at the moment. So COVID is obviously significantly affecting our borders, and there is ongoing closures there as well too. What is your advice, particularly when patients can cross borders to access treatment, but there's these ongoing issues of carer access across the border, particularly when it's not necessarily a single carer. Sometimes because of the length of time, a patient may require multiple carers. What is your advice in that sort of situation to a patient?
Well, I mean, my advice is don't cross borders if you can avoid it, firstly. I mean, clearly patients have good reasons to cross borders. You know, they're chasing down what they understand to be the best available treatment. But step one, take a time out and check that you need to cross the border, given the politics of what's going on at the moment. There is, of course, special border bubble situations where there are specific circumstances. I generally feel that patients who need to cross the border to access a treatment that isn't available in their own state should be supported. And there are many treatments where patients, carers need to be supported as well to do that. And we certainly have examples where we've been able to do that in collaboration with our state governments. But there has to be a strong medical case for that. The best example might be CAR T cells, which are available in some states and not others. So let's take the example of a patient who lives in New South Wales who wants to access CAR T cells. I'd say, honestly, crossing the border is going to be a challenge. And you've got CAR T cells in New South Wales, that should be option one. If you're a patient in Tasmania or South Australia that doesn't have CAR T cells, I'd say, well, Queensland's looking pretty good right now. WA is looking pretty good right now. They should be the options you go for. The good news is that we actually, for CAR T cells, we actually coordinate on a national level. And we've had several examples of patients that have been referred, for example, to Peter Mac at a time that Victoria looks pretty ordinary in the COVID department, where we said, look, we can see you, we can look after you. You may have trouble going home at the end of it. Have you thought about a different state? And we'll discuss your case in the national meeting. So we try to do that for these really high cost special treatments. But for other things, I guess for all of us, we do our best to minimise crossing the border as much as we can, given the difficulty.
Yeah. No, I think that is probably sound advice as well to obviously avoid border crossings if possible at the moment. But I think that, yeah, as you say, it's not always possible. You did actually mention as well too, compassionate access. Are you able to give a bit of an example of what is some of the criteria for patients to actually access compassionate access?
So the companies have a situation where they know they've got a good drug, right? They know that their drug works, but they're not in a situation where they're yet able to market it either in Australia and sometimes even anywhere in the world. But they know that their trial shows the drug is actually saving lives. And they have a strategic reason as well for familiarising doctors with the use of the drug. So we mustn't forget that companies aren't going to do things that aren't in their own interests, right? We have to be honest, it's true. I wish it wasn't true, but companies do have their own agenda. And their agenda might be familiarising doctors with their drugs. So you have to be wary of that. And then they have to be able to defend themselves with the regulators if anything goes wrong. For example, a patient has a drug that is not approved anywhere and dies on the drug. That can happen, right? Particularly because you're dealing with patients who are often sick because they've run out of standard treatment lines, not always sick, but sometimes sick. And that can happen. And of course, the regulators come down on companies very, very hard for giving away toxic treatments. So usually the companies will say, listen, the patient really has to need it. So usually they'll have criteria like is up and about, fit enough to have the treatment, doesn't have features of their disease that is going to make them particularly susceptible to toxic side effects of the treatment, and has exhausted standard treatment options. That's a very classic line. Have you exhausted the standard treatment options? If you've had chemo 1, 2, 3, and 4, CAR T cells and this, and you've everything the Australian government funds and you've run out of options, then that's where compassionate access programs are generally focused. And I can tell you the companies actually really nitpick, like show us the blood test on the 22nd of March. What was the platelet count? Why was the platelet count low that day? And sometimes there'll be things like platelet count or kidney function that just restrict a doctor's capacity to prescribe. And the rationale, there is a genuine, authentic rationale why those criteria exist. They can be quite strict.
Yeah, and I can see Amy nodding along to that as well too, because obviously compassionate access is quite close to Amy's heart as well too. Amy, would you like to share your opinions on, you've briefly mentioned your opinions on clinical trials before, but what would you suggest to a patient to ensure that they're actually aware of what clinical trials are available to them? What can they do?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I think, obviously, Professor Dickinson outlined all the ways that you can search for the information. Aside from asking your doctor, I've personally found that social media is a very powerful sharing mechanism, and both the Lymphoma Down Under, the Australian Facebook group, and also it's quite interesting to join some of the local or the global Facebook groups, because you'll get discussion there about treatments that are not yet approved in Australia. And that's sometimes where those clinical trial opportunities are going to arise. And that's how you might access those treatments in Australia. There's, websites and a ClinRefer app that you can go on, and you can search in just keywords for your particular subtype of lymphoma, and different trials that are currently recruiting in Australia will pop up. But yeah, definitely, I think social media has been probably the most powerful information tool for me, because there's a lot of discussion between patients about what kind of lymphoma they have and what treatment they're currently getting and how they're accessing it.
I think that point that you raised, Amy, about trials, I didn't touch on. And it's so important because, when something's in a compassionate access program, that's fine. But if you can be on a trial, that's so much better, because you're contributing to future access to everyone, the evidence base. But also you're likely to be kept very safe, kept within the expertise of people who are familiar with the drugs. And there are examples of classes of drugs. When we think about the bispecific agents, where you'd say, look, there's a compassionate access program for this bispecific, and there's a trial for that bispecific. Which one should I do? And in that situation, as a researcher, I'd say, speak to your doctor, find out more. But the default should always, in my view, as the doctor and a researcher, should be trial first, compassionate access second. But it depends on an individual's circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that is solid advice as well too. And I think a lot of the time people have trouble accessing clinical, a compassionate access if you haven't explored certain clinical trial options as well too. Sharon, I might bring you in as well at the moment too. And Michael, you might like to also comment on this as well too. But regional patients who are wanting to get second opinions, what is the best way to try and help facilitate this? Would either of you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. And I think this is actually an area where we worry about regional patients, because you need sometimes that second opinion. And the easiest way really is and a second opinion is often a good opinion. It doesn't mean that the first opinion is wrong. It's actually giving you some reassurance that you're actually heading in the right direction, or it's actually giving you some additional choices that you didn't know were available to you. So if your current treating doctor is open to it, they may refer you to someone else for a second opinion. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, then the other option is go to the GP and just ask for another opinion to see someone else. Or, contact someone like Lymphoma Australia as well. We can certainly help direct patients to another opinion.
And all I would add to that is that telehealth helps. I would also say that some centres are under a bit of pressure with COVID-19 at the moment. So telehealth really does help, but second opinions can be complicated. And one of the things is I've often found a disconnect between patient expectations and about how healthcare systems share information. So you'd think that you got your PET scan and your biopsy done at a hospital in Melbourne, that the other hospital would be able to see it. Actually, to do a second opinion, I have to get an admin officer to get the report across, then we get the tissue posted across, then a pathologist looks at it for 2 hours, then we get the images imported, then we look in the MDM. So the total time for a second opinion is quite long. So the really important thing with second opinions is to be really aware of your own information and where the gaps might be. Have your medication list done, if you can get access to prior letters, anything you can do to facilitate the sharing of knowledge, and assume that the doctor you're speaking to doesn't have the same access to the records that you think they should. We try really hard, but it's a huge amount of work. And sometimes I just can't see the scan that was done in Tasmania. I just can't see it. And it literally, and you think, gee, the internet, what about the internet? It's like literally people are posting CDs. So that's the one thing I'd say is do get a second opinion, but just be mindful of the transactional cost of second opinions, and that some centres are struggling a little bit at the moment with second opinions because of COVID-19.
Yeah, I think it is really important to try and normalise that option of being able to obtain a second opinion, whilst also being really mindful of those sorts of things as well, to the amount of time I spend clinically as well, to putting on my detective hat and trying to find where every sort of investigation has previously been done for a patient who's coming to our facility. It's hard work and it takes a long time. So anything that patients can do to try and facilitate that process is significantly helpful as well too, if you are going after a second opinion. Sharon, would you like to actually share a bit of an option? We keep talking about the way that Lymphoma Australia can also help to ensure patients have equitable access to care, but would you actually like to share a bit of an example of how you've helped to facilitate that care?
Yeah, sure. And I guess I'd just like to open with too for everyone is the good news is that over probably the last 5 to 10 years, the number of new approvals for lymphoma has been so great. It's been like we probably are the #1 disease within the last 5 years that have had the most approvals on the PBS and the MBS. And that is because of all the research and clinical trials that is happening. The problem that we've got is what happens before it gets on the PBS. And this is where this equity of access comes in. And this is why I guess we're trying to share this information with everybody here today. I know it's simple to say knowledge is power, but for you to even know you need a second opinion sometimes is you actually have to have the knowledge to begin with that maybe this isn't quite right for me, or what do I need to know? And therefore, I think this is where organisations like Lymphoma Australia, we come in, we're wanting you to know exactly what you need to know for your subtype. So you can look at that and you can go to your treating doctor and say, oh, is there any other treatments that I could be thinking about? Or is there a clinical trial that is available to me? Or like Amy was saying, she's gaining additional information, and then you take it back to your doctor, and then hopefully that nudges them along as well and go, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. We don't want patients missing out on a clinical trial that's just down the road for them, or we don't want a patient missing out on compassionate access because you just didn't even know that was available. And that's where it becomes tough. You've got cancer, you've got lymphoma, but how do I get all of this as well? Use Lymphoma Australia. That's what we're developing all the time as well. That's what Michael and the other doctors are working with us too, to make sure that everybody has the information at the right time and you're not missing out. But like for getting back to Erica's question though, PBS and PBAC and MSAC, we put in applications as well when we know there's something coming up that is being considered for approval for lymphoma. We're actually going to put something into them as well on behalf of all lymphoma patients, but it's also where Lymphoma Australia might sort of go, hey guys, if you've had access to this medicine on clinical trial or whatever, can you also make a submission, because they need to hear from you as much as us as to how much that is actually going to help them.
There's one slightly politically incorrect thing that I'm just going to hope that all 136 of you take very softly. Look, it's controversial and it might upset you. Sometimes doctors like to own patients, and they're proud people. They like to provide the solution, and they like to be that person who helps their, and particularly if they have a relationship with their patients, right? You have a good rapport, you want to fix them. And there is just a little hurdle to think about sending a patient away. There's a cost. It is personal, your relationship with your doctor, but there is just this little hurdle. And sometimes you just need to say, now listen, is there anything in Melbourne that could possibly help me? Are you sure there are no trials down the road? Are you sure there's no access program down the road? And just really look your doctor in the eye and say it, because we are human and we like to help, but sometimes we just need a little reminder to look around. And sometimes we're in a rush and we don't think. So do own that with your doctor, and do own it, because we're not perfect, as you know.
If I could weigh in here, Erica.
Yes, absolutely, Amy.
I really agree with that. I think about my own experience. My first diagnosis, I was very green. I showed up at my haematologist and it's like, well, okay, what chemotherapy am I getting? And an option was presented, and that was it. And I didn't question it. I didn't, and it was straightforward. The second time, I informed myself and I armed myself with knowledge, and we had several options. And what really changed the trajectory of my conversations was me upfront saying, I can pay, I can self-fund, because I could see that my doctor, I could see the cogs in his brain ticking. I knew he was thinking of something, and he was quite troubled, and his whole demeanor changed once I made it clear that I was willing to self-fund.
That's so true. I mean, that is so true. Like doctors, there are some doctors who think it's not for me to know if a patient can afford it. I'll tell them about everything. And that can lead to problems for patients who feel like they're missing out on something because they don't have money. And there are some doctors who think, I can't tell anyone about anything because I have to assume no one can afford anything. And you have these extremes, right? And so that's it. The patient has to open the door sometimes. It shouldn't be the case, but sometimes you have to. Now, I am literally a minute away from giving a talk to a different audience, so I have to go
run away, Michael,
before I start getting frantic phone calls from the hosts.
No.
So please excuse me. And it was a lovely
Thank
discussion.
you for your time,
lovely
Michael.
to hear your story, Amy.
Thank you.
I think while we're talking about copay as well too, and self-funding drugs, I think that it's really important that people know the different ways that they're actually able to do that, because I think it's probably quite scary for some people hearing these options, and that you can pay for these thousands of dollars of drugs, and it seems unreachable for some. But I think it is really important, particularly that you are aware as well too, speaking to your social worker like Andrea as well too, to discuss your options. There is options for accessing your superannuation, particularly if you have a life-limiting illness as well too, and accessing any sort of life insurance that you have. So don't assume that anything is off limits because you may not have the money in your bank account right at that point in time. There is options for you as well too.
Erica, I'd also like to add too, if you have private health insurance, you can also ask the doctor to write to the private health insurance company, and they may also partially or fully fund as well. But I think what we actually want to be able to do is get away from this too, so that it's not actually those who can pay, those who can't pay. But what the point we're trying to make, and what Michael made really well, was you need to be an informed person in the conversation, so that if you only know what you know. So if the doctor's not telling you about a drug, but if you raise it, then that may open more doors for you. And some doctors may not even know that on the TGA website, there's a special access scheme as well. So they may turn around to you and say, oh, it's not available for you. Yes, but they can still apply for it as well. So you need to be, and this is why we're wanting to do this session today, is to make sure that you are more aware. But when it gets really complicated, you can contact us too, and we can actually help you get across all of those. And the other probably good question to ask, particularly during COVID times now as well, is if COVID wasn't around right now, what would my treatment options be? Because again, you as the patient want to make the decision as well. You might say, no, I want this treatment, not that treatment. Don't pick treatments for me. Let me be part of that decision making as well.
About that shared decision making process as well too, and making sure that you use your active voice, as one of my team members always says. Ensure you use your active voice, and don't be afraid to take that to your doctor as well too.
On the point of COVID, Sharon, I think that's, you know, we're having less and less time in front of our doctors, and we've moved to telehealth consultations. It's a little bit harder sometimes to have those difficult conversations about, is there another option? Can I get a second opinion? Is there a clinical trial? And, you know, we have such limited time for the doctors to get to know you as a patient and as a person. I know it's a very difficult thing. They don't want to have those financial type discussions as to whether you can afford to pay for something yourself. For me, I was definitely not a wealthy person, and I was pleasantly surprised that, you know, when I did look at self-funding an option, it wasn't as expensive as I thought, because there is those cost sharing programs, like Professor Dickinson mentioned, whereby you pay for a treatment and the company might fund the rest. You know, it's not always going to be $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. Sometimes it's more manageable. It might be $15,000, like it was in my case, was what it was going to cost. And, you know, I know a lot of people don't have that lying in their bank account. I certainly haven't at times in my life, but, you know, we live in an age of, you know, people want to help and support. And, you know, luckily we live in Australia. I know the US, it's often said that, you know, the health system relies on GoFundMes. But, you know, I often have seen communities come together to support something like this. So yeah, that would be my message. Just, you know, open the conversation, and there is so many different ways that you can access things, drugs, if they're not on the PBS. Yeah, just start the conversation.
And I'd just like to add to it, and I'm also thinking around what we have got approved, and like we use the example of CAR T, and I'll also use the example of transplants, stem cell transplants, and that. Again, you may need to travel, and particularly rural, regional, and these are only maybe done in large metropolitan cities. And that's why you need to ask the doctor the question, what else is available? We don't want a doctor making a decision that you can't have CAR T at the moment because of border closures. Like Michael explained, there are ways around all of that. So make sure the more informed you are, the more you can ask about, but definitely if you need a transplant, well, how do I get to my transplant sort of thing? And if it's not working, contact Lymphoma Australia, talk to us as well so that we can help you make it happen. Don't give up just because everything else is going on around us at the moment as too.
I think that's very solid advice in these troubling times. I think that if you are uncertain about your treatment and you do have questions, you need to ask the question. And I think that what Sharon's saying as well too about asking is COVID impacting upon the treatment that you're offered. I think that that's a really good place to start with your doctor as well too. Is your treatment being adjusted to account for COVID? Because people don't necessarily know that a change has been made to their treatment or what they would be offered for treatment if COVID wasn't around. So I think, yes, I think that's very important at the moment. That's why this session is just so timely. But I think on that note, I might start wrapping up this session and move into our next session. So thank you very much, Amy, for your time. I very much appreciate it, and all the best with the rest of your treatment. And thank you, Sharon, for offering your insights as well too.